Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, and those are the very first words of the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, written by Madison. The First Amendment goes on to talk about the things we're most familiar with, such as freedom of speech, the press, the right of people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. But the very first line of the First Amendment has to do with religion and the prohibition against establishing any kind of state religion. Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. You found us. Thank you. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Ecclesiastes probably said it best in chapter 1, verse 9, quote, "Everything that has been will be again. Everything that has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun," close quote. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. Your hosts are Marshall Newman, Mike Mendenhall, and myself, Blake Henke. In this podcast, we will cover topics of history, politics, and religion, and how they interact, and also how they relate to modern-day events and themes. We will try to cut through the biases, oversimplifications, and myths to learn better lessons from the past and to see what they can tell us about the present and maybe even the future. The question that we're going to debate today is, was the United States founded as a Christian nation? Was it intended to be a Christian nation? Is it a Christian nation today? Whether the U.S. is a Christian nation is the subject of intense political and social debate, balancing cultural history against legal secularism. While a majority of Americans do identify as Christian, and many point to historical, cultural, and religious influences on the nation's founding, the U.S. Constitution establishes a secular government that guarantees religious freedom and prohibits any state religion. Christian nationalists, activists, and right-wing television preachers often claim that the United States was founded to be a Christian nation. Even some politicians agree. Even some today agree to that. If the people who make this assertion were merely saying that most Americans are Christians, they might have a point. But those who argue that America is a Christian nation usually mean something more, insisting that the country should be officially Christian. Now, what would officially Christian mean?
That is a problematic definition because there is no quote-unquote Christian religion. There is Christianity, but then there's all sorts of different religions that ascribe to the principles or claim to ascribe to the principles of Christ and the teachings in the Bible and the church fathers, if you want to get into that. But it's kind of like Christianity is a big piece of territory, and it's kind of like, let's just say you have at one end, you have people who practice and preach liberation theology, and this is a certain approach that you find among Jesuits Catholics, or even things that we're getting from the Pope right now. And then you get fundamentalists who like to go around handling snakes and insist that, Christianity is...
The Pentecostals,
yes. Yes, the Pentecostals. But they find ways to find spiritual satisfaction. There's no universal notion of Christianity. And I would argue that kind of the secular approach that we took was to kind of defang that to prevent, okay, if we're Christian, then what kind of Christian are we? Are we high church Episcopalians, or are we like running around and speaking in tongues here? They are different approaches, very different brands, and it's like I don't see how you could come up with a a brand that would satisfy everybody and not offend somebody by exclusion of certain tenets.
Well, and in fact, that's a problem that the Church of England experienced.
Yes.
There were all different groups of people that wanted to worship in different ways and thought the church was doing it the wrong way, which led to some of the colonies actually being founded that we'll get to in a minute.
And the English Civil War.
Okay.
And also, if we want to, the Founding Fathers actually were very much aware of recent European history, say going back 100 years, and the 30 Years' War, which was basically about religion and in Europe. And it was kind of devastating, and they were aware of the cost that these type of conflicts, once they become something that's left up to armies and people disputing matters with weapons and things, can get pretty ugly pretty quick.
And this all dates back, what you're talking about there, Marshall, is the 1600s, right? So
yes, roughly 1618
the
to
1648 was
yes.
the 30 Years' War.
Yes.
And the English Civil War was in the 1640s.
It ran along the same time period. They overlap.
Went a little bit longer. It went a little bit later.
I mean, if you really want to get into it, probably the English Civil War in one fashion or another persisted until really the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Parliament's supremacy was actually established once and for all over in Britain.
Yeah, but we're talking about the 1600s is my point.
Yes,
that's the era that you're talking about.
And this impacts the Founding Fathers. They are aware that this has happened. People have come over to America to escape this sort of thing. So as a result, they want to avoid this. This is something they see as an object lesson to avoid and to try to prevent from happening and affecting outcomes in the United States.
From their point of view, this had happened 100 to 150 years earlier.
Yes.
Which is about the same time back to our Civil War, let's say, right? It was 150 or so years ago. So that gives you a time frame to think about how immediate this was to them.
And a lot of the sort of political doctrines that come out that the Founding Fathers are ascribing to are going to be generated by this contest, which begins with attempts to kind of standardize religious practices throughout the United Kingdom, or Great Britain as it was called then.
Well, and so Marshall, you've talked about which denomination or creed or sect or whatever you want to call it,
or just style of worship.
Yes. would be official. Is a problem.
Smells and bells or snakes.
Yeah.
but we can take it further. But we can also take it further than that, right? I mean, you have obviously the schism between Catholicism and Protestantism and Orthodox too, right? Yeah. To a lot of people, this makes a big difference. Some of them question the true Christianity of the other main groups, shall we say, religious groups within Christianity. There's that. Are Mormons Christian? A lot of Christians would say that.
Question.
A lot of Christians would say Mormons are not. Mormons would say, "Well, yes, we are."
Yeah.
So are they part of the state religion, or are they not? Right. That's another thing that there'd be a broad disagreement on, probably.
Do we need to suppress them then if they're not part of the state religion?
Well, I mean, and we didn't really answer Blake's question yet. Blake's question was, what does the establishment of a state religion mean or imply? What would it mean?
Christian, right.
And what Marshall is asking right there starts to get into that aspect of it. So
I think that's the problem.
Once you do identify what you mean by Christianity, that's fraught, but okay.
Yeah.
Let's say you do, okay. Then what happens? What does that then imply for the way civic society works? Not just religion, but civic society works.
Yes.
So if you have a state religion, it seems to me, jump in and tell me where I'm wrong here, but one aspect clearly would be the government probably would fund it.
Definitely if it's established.
Right? If it's an established church. The government would take policy guidance from it.
Yes, like Iran.
Either directly or indirectly in some way. Like Iran. But, I mean, you wouldn't have, since you have a state religion, you wouldn't have the government doing something that the church said a government shouldn't do, almost by definition. Right?
Yeah,
it has to follow the dictates of its established church.
Right.
So
that would be another implication of having a state religion.
It would work outside of laws because you would have kind of like a council of elders to use a good term from the Iranian system, that basically tells you what you're allowed to do or not do.
Right. There's a higher law than your civic laws that you pass, and there's a higher law that we have to also obey. That would have to be woven into the texture of your governance of your country.
And there is no constitutional provision for this body to exist that could adjudicate what is right, what is wrong, what is Christian, what is not. That you would have to create that in order for that to happen.
Yes, and like you were saying, you'd have to determine, if you don't have this higher body, you'd either have to create one.
Yeah.
Somehow, extra constitutionally, you'd have to create one.
I think you would have to pass an amendment to the Constitution in order to have this body.
I think so,
for
too.
it to have any authority.
I think so, too, right? There's that. And then you'd have to decide how to staff it.
Yeah.
Who would be on it.
Yeah.
Which then brings us back to which is the...
Who selects it?
You're right, that's a good one, too. Which brings us back to all the complexities of which sect, which denomination, which creed are we going to pick.
And then to move on to the 14th...
Or creeds. Could be more than one, I guess.
The 14th Amendment. If you're going to restrict, say, selection for the Council of Elders, as we're calling it, for a term of convenience, does that mean that only Christians get to vote? Does that mean that basically if you are not a Christian, if you're Jewish, you don't get to vote in this election because, your religion is the wrong religion? And under the 14th Amendment, everybody is equal under the law. So you can't create something that does not have status and restrict the voting to just a group of people, albeit the majority of the people in the country, but they don't all follow the same tenets and beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, can Jews vote? Can Muslims vote? Can Buddhists vote? Can atheists vote?
Yeah.
Can Unitarians vote? I don't know. I mean, all these questions come up.
Well, are Unitarians and Mormons considered Christians then? Because if you're Unitarian, you do not believe in the Trinity. If you're Mormon, you have a book that is meant to be an addition to the Bible that other people do not recognize as a sacred text.
And you have a prophet that they don't recognize as a prophet.
Exactly.
Another implication would be then you'd have to have taxes supporting the church, I assume. The government would fund the church. Now, so if Christianity is the state religion, again, whatever that means, but let's say it is. So do Jews have to pay a tax to support Christianity? Do Muslims have to? Do atheists have to?
Maybe they might have to pay an extra tax because they're not Christian.
I would think they would have to pay.
I mean, in Muslim countries where you had, they did not have persecution of different religious groups, but they did have a tax if you were Christian, if you were Jewish or something else, that was levied against you in order to encourage you to maybe convert to the Muslim faith. And I mean, just imagine if we have an established church, wouldn't it be nice if we could just bring all these atheists to God, so we'll just tax the bejesus out of them until they basically, get the water
to convert.
Yeah,
yes.
Get the water sprinkled over their heads, So yeah, the idea of doing this presents all sorts of difficulties, and I would argue and I would question what are we getting out of this? What are we actually going to get out of this? How does this make us a better country? And maybe we might want to come back to this at the end of our series here, but I would put that out there as, what exactly are you gaining if you insist on orthodoxy? Has this ever worked out well for anybody in the past?
Well, you're making the point for me, which is
okay.
what the Founding Fathers did ultimately decide, which was to not have an established religion.
Yes. And I just took the liberty here of taking a look at the Wikipedia article on state religion. And in the first paragraph, it describes, aspects quickly of what a state religion is, what the aspects of it are. It is a religion or creed officially endorsed by a sovereign state.
Yeah.
A state with an official religion, also known as a confessional state.
Yes.
I had not heard that before. While not a secular state, is not necessarily a theocracy. State religions are subject to advantageous treatment by official or government-sanctioned establishments of them, ranging from incentivizing citizens to recognize and practice them through government endorsement, to having public spending on the maintenance of religious property and clergy be unrestricted. But the state does not need to be under the legislative control of the clergy as it would be in a theocracy. Generally, the state religion has more rights and fewer restrictions in the country than other religions do in the country. So we've touched on all these aspects, but that kind of summarizes what the implications of it are.
Well, you see, and you know what's interesting about this? In countries that do have a state religion, you know, either in fact or historically, one of the things that you find from Americans who go over to these countries and are kind of like looking at this thing through their own lenses, they'll notice that except for days like Christmas and Easter, or high holy days of one sort or another, there's sparse attendance. And so they basically assume that, okay, they're not religious. Well, people are religious in these countries. They just don't feel compelled. There is a certain sense that Lutheranism in Scandinavian countries is always there, always with you. You don't necessarily need to show up every week. Here, where you do not have an established religion, where people are kind of at liberty to do what they like, church attendance, even though it's on the decline, is still much higher than what you find over in Europe in countries where there is an established religion. You know, you and I, Mike, when we were in Italy, we would see this in churches. Most of the people in there were tourists when we were there.
Well, and in Europe, I've seen this in the Netherlands and in Italy, where I think I saw it in Scotland too, where there's churches which have been converted into discos and things, and bars, because they went out of business as a church.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, the whole thing about religion in Europe versus religion in the United States is fraught, because my understanding of the socio-political background of it is that World War I really destroyed a lot of European people's faith in religious belief. Because marching off to World War I in 1914, they were told, you know, God's on your side, and you know, you're the march of civilization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was such a destructive, awful war. It destroyed the 19th century culture, the 19th century idea of all this 100+ years of societal and technological advancement. It led to this horrible disaster in the mud of the trenches and such. And after that, you really wound up with a sharp decline in religiosity in Europe. That did not happen in the United States. And so as a result, the United States has remained a much more religious country, or has become a much more religious country over time than European countries are. It dates back to a little over 100 years ago with the experience of World War I. That's my understanding of what happened.
That there is some points to that, and to be honest, among European intellectuals, the reason why the Bolshevik Revolution resonated was like, here was something good that actually came out of the war, and they would defend this even in the face of disasters and people like Stalin. Okay, this is the great hope for working people. Now, I will tell you this, though. I have a book which basically talks about some of the stranger tropes that came out of World War I as far as religiosity went, where people imagine at Ypres seeing archers from Agincourt show up to defend the British.
Oh, the angels of Mons.
The angels of Mons, yes. There is that happens as well in conjunction with increased secularization. There's this myth-making stuff, and people, even who were there, would insist that they saw things, miraculous things, happening during World War I. We probably don't want to get into this, save this for another topic or another show, but I would say you have two things happening at the same time during that.
Well, you do, but I mean, I think the bottom line is that over the last 100 years or so, Europe and the United States have gone in separate directions.
Yes.
And that Europe has become much less religious, whereas the United States has retained a religiosity that used to exist in Europe, but largely has, I'm not saying it's become extinct by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly not what it once was, and it's a much less religious continent than it was prior to World War I.
Well,
I think that's the main issue here.
Well, I think that, and I would argue, though, the fact that religion is more like an open marketplace of ideas here, as opposed to like something that the state sponsors has contributed to that.
Well, sure, but I mean, to me, the bigger point though is that while that's true, but I think that's a subset of just the broader issue. The United States has remained quite religious.
No, I'm not disputing
that. And that's the main, and that compared to other Western countries, and I think that's a significant thing to consider.
The percentage of nuns meaning people who profess no religious affinity, has grown.
In the 21st century.
More recently, yes.
And I'm going to say, again, going back to my point about what it means when you have an established religion, that it actually hurts religion. It hurts the brand.
Getting back to the main theme of our discussion, today we hear religious extremists and their allies insist that the United States was designed to be officially Christian and that our laws should enforce the doctrines of explicitly their version of Christianity. Is this viewpoint accurate? Is there anything in the Constitution that gives special treatment or preference to Christianity? Did the founders of our government believe this or intend to create a government that gave special recognition to Christianity? The answer to all these questions is no. The U.S. Constitution is a wholly secular document. It contains no mention of Christianity or Jesus Christ. In fact, the Constitution refers to religion only twice in the First Amendment, which bars laws, quote, respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, close quote, and in Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for public office. Both of these provisions are evidence that the country was not founded to be officially Christian.
One thing we might want to mention for our listeners here, religious tests. At the time, over in England and over in Europe, there was a requirement that if one held office, one would have to agree or submit proof that one was a member of the dominant religion. So in this case, say, for a number of years over in Britain, Jews could not be elected to Parliament because they could not pass the religious test to be able to go in as Christians. So that's what religious tests mean. It's not like you have to sit exams or something like that on religious matters to be qualified.
Would you like to hear what the counter-argument is? Because I've heard it made.
What?
To what you were just saying about,
yes, let's
absolutely.
hear the counter-argument.
If you go on, say, YouTube, there are videos that are recorded where you'll have one like liberal person sit down at a table and they'll be encircled by 20 or 30 conservative people who disagree with them. You know? Then they come one-to-one at the table and sit there and debate with the liberal person. There's videos like that. Anyway, I saw one or two of these in which they were talking about religion in the United States, Christianity. And here's what the counter-argument is to what you're saying, okay? And their counter-argument is this. When the Founding Fathers founded the United States, their framework of understanding of religion was entirely Christian. I'm not saying this is accurate. I'm just saying this is what the counter-argument is, right? Was entirely Christian in nature. When they wrote down things using the word religion, they were only talking about Christianity. They were not talking about Judaism. They were not talking about Islam. They were not talking about Buddhism. They certainly weren't talking about atheists. They were talking they were talking about Christianity. So whenever you see the Constitution talking about religion, it's talking actually about Christianity, and you should interpret it that way. That's what their counter-argument is.
Well, factually, that's not true.
I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's what they think the Constitution says. That's their argument going in to say that what Blake just said is incorrect.
We're going to cover some of that.
I've always heard what Blake said as being correct, yes. But I'm just saying that's the counter-argument I hear. It's ridiculous to think that the Founding Fathers had anybody other than Christians in mind when they wrote any of that.
These guys also insist that Moses is somehow a founding father of the United States, which is ridiculous.
Again, these kind of folks also have this idea the United States is God's chosen country. He deliberately made it to carry forward his policies, his things he wants, whatever, God's will on earth has much to do with the existence of the United States. And therefore its founding, I guess, dates all the way back to Moses or however far back you want to take it. But that's another line of thinking here. But anyway.
What do they do about Israel then?
Leaving that aside, I mean, but that's their counter-argument, is that you need to look all this through the prism of Christianity and nothing else.
Most of the people that were here in the colonial times up until our founding were of some form of Christian background. that is actually true. We're going to go through that when we get to the colonies, but I think they explicitly set up a secular form of government to deal with some of the problems that we've already covered.
So we can table that whole discussion for now.
Yeah.
And we'll get back into that later after we go through what you're going to go through. But I'm just saying that's what the counter argument that they make is, and that's the framework that they approach this from.
Right. So there are a couple of references to God or religion explicitly in the Constitution. There are 4 references to God or a creator in the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to borrow here from a gentleman named Thomas Tweed, who wrote an article called What the Declaration of Independence Does and Does Not Say About God. The Second Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5 delegates to write the Declaration. Jefferson, the main author, penned the first draft in his rented room in central Philadelphia. John Adams and Ben Franklin offered suggestions before they sent the document to Congress for further revision and approval. Now, the document included 27 complaints against King George III and explained reasons for revolt. It used terms for God 4 times as it made its case. In its opening paragraph, Jefferson proposed that, quote, the laws of nature and of nature's God, end quote, grant humans equal status and entitle Americans to dissolve the political bands with Britain. As historians have shown, Franklin added a phrase to suggest that those rights have been, quote, endowed by their creator, end quote. Congress then added 2 phrases to the final paragraph that portray God as a moral judge and a guiding hand. The delegates mentioned the supreme judge of the world who punishes evil and rewards good, a description that almost all political and religious leaders would have agreed with at the time. They end by announcing that, quote, with a firm reliance on the projection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. So those are the references to God, providence, religion in the Declaration.
And those references, I would argue, are not exclusively Christian. For example, a Muslim would probably see God in much the same way as is portrayed there. Or, even a Buddhist could see the world working in that fashion. Or someone who's Jewish. So there is not, even though you have references to God written in this document, written by people who are, in some sense, Christians, which we'll get into later as to how orthodox they might be, but this is still not something that cuts this off and marks it as exclusively a Christian doctrine or Christian document that is being reflected in the Declaration of Independence.
And this author, Thomas Tweed, does make exactly that point in the next paragraph.
Oh, sorry.
No, I wasn't going to read it. I'm glad you said it. The reference to providence doesn't specify how divine influence works. However, it leaves plenty of room for the founders' quote, diverging religious interpretations, which is what you're talking about.
But it could be anybody else.
It could be any other religion.
It could be any other religion. I don't see that any other religion would have difficulties with those words and say, I cannot support these notions because it goes against my religion, if I'm a Muslim or if I'm Jewish or if I'm Buddhist or something else. Because most religions kind of would ascribe some sort of like divine presence to promote order in the world and justice and so forth.
And also the idea of a creator. Creating everything is
universal,
I think, among religions, right? Unless you're an atheist, I think you think some deity, some force of some kind created everything you see around you. So it would not exclude, the idea of a creator would not exclude anyone either. Any religious person.
I mean, you could go. I would argue you might be able to go back to classical Greece and Rome, which actually did have which would have as big an impact, I would say, on the founding fathers and their perceptions of the world as the Bible and tenets of Christianity in their worldview, and they would accept these statements that are in the Declaration of Independence as being valid. They would have an issue with, say, like, natural rights, which is an Enlightenment concept. It is not in the Bible, the idea of natural rights. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the social contract here.
And we will get to that.
Yes.
We will get to that.
Yes, but that's where that's coming from. It's not coming from the Bible.
No, and the Declaration was actually read aloud in churches as part of the proclamation of it to the colonies at the time.
And that would be logical because that's where everybody showed up on Sunday, and you could get the largest gathering of your village or town or something like that in a church. It's like television.
Getting back to the original question, I would just say, and we've touched on this already to a degree, the answer to the question is a bit nuanced. It is true that the 13 colonies were founded largely by Christian settlers from England, mostly. Florida was settled by Spain, which was also a Christian nation. Canada was colonized by France and Great Britain, which were both Christian nations. There were not many Jews, if any, in the early colonies. There were not, if any, Muslims that I'm aware of in the early colonies. There might have been some slaves who were picked up from somewhere that practiced Islam, but it was rare. Other religions were not seemingly represented at all. There were no Hindus that I'm aware of, or Sikhs, or Buddhists. So yes, the predominant population that started our country were of Christian descent and of Judeo-Christian ideals.
There would be a small groups of Jews, but it kind of depends on what period you're talking about when you're talking about colonial America. But they did have settled populations, which is more than you could say for any other group that you're talking about. In places like Newport, New York, Charleston, Savannah, and after the Revolution in Richmond.
Well, I mean, like you said, that depends on when you're talking about.
Yeah, it does.
So, I suppose in the early colonial period, I don't know what I mean by that, 1600s, it'd be much rarer than later.
1600 is a whole century there.
No, I know, but I'm saying somewhere in the 1600s, the earlier period there, right? You would probably have few to none. And then gradually there'd be settlements that would develop over time, so that by later in the 1600s to 1700s, you would start to have Jewish communities.
Say like when you bring in New York into the, there were Jewish communities in the Netherlands that transferred to New York City, or New Amsterdam as it was called then. So it just depends on when.
So acknowledging that I don't know what I'm talking about when I discuss the Jewish presence in North America, I've taken the liberty of looking it up and seeing if the internet knows. So if it knows what it's talking about, it tells me that the Jewish presence in North America, in what is now the United States, began in September 1654 with the arrival of 23 Sephardic Jewish refugees from Recife, Brazil, in New Amsterdam, which is now New York City. That was the first organized Jewish community in the North American mainland. There may have been Jewish people who arrived before that, but there was no organized community that's known until 1654. And then after that, Jewish communities began to grow in major port cities.
Yes. In
Newport, Rhode Island, in Philadelphia, in Charleston, South Carolina, and in Savannah, Georgia, were noted communities. So there's your answer on the growth of Jewish communities in colonial America.
Now, one thing to mention here, that during this period, during the colonial period, attempts were made to establish communities in places like Boston, and that was rejected because there was a strong bias against this. This was not something that was necessarily favored to exist. Even though Boston is a big merchant city, it's not just merchant, it's like there's got to be a certain degree of acceptance of people who are Jewish to exist in these places.
All right, so as we have discussed quite a bit already, the United States of America was not founded as a Christian nation. It was not intended to be a Christian nation. It was founded by people who were largely Christian of one stripe or another, but there was actually a very broad spectrum of belief. Thomas Jefferson, for one, was a deist. He believed that there was a master creator who operated much like a clockmaker who set things in motion originally.
But basically just let things go.
But didn't intervene in human history.
Yes.
Jefferson also did not believe in the divinity of Christ.
He also didn't really believe in miracles, because there's the Jefferson Bible where he basically goes through and takes out all the miraculous teachings.
He cut them out with a knife.
Yes. And basically established, he viewed Christianity as a great moral force, which is part and parcel of how people in the founding era would view religion. As you can have belief in all these miracles and things, but which they had divided opinions on, but they also had a belief in the need for a moral system, a system of morality to kind of guide the nation. And, they could support something like that, but not something that you would actually, and they would not be supporting it monetarily or anything like that.
Here's a useful checklist, I think, on deism, okay, of what makes it up. As you were saying, they believed in a clockmaker God who set everything in motion and then sits back and watches. This God does not intervene in human affairs. They reject the idea of anything which they would call superstitious. So there's no miracles, right? And there's no divine intervention, so you can't say that this happened because of God. No, it didn't. God is just watching. They don't believe in holy books. They don't believe in prophecies. They don't believe in supernatural revelations. They do believe in rational thinking and scientific observation. They think that the best way to understand the Creator is to study nature, because that's what He created.
Yes.
Okay. In a scientific way, but at least to observe nature, to understand the Creator. And they believe that you should focus on morality and ethical behavior rather than on ritualistic worship and practices.
So it's
all about thinking, and none of it's about really emotion. It's a very rational kind of approach to it. But they don't agree with atheists in the sense that atheists reject the idea of a creator. Deists believe in a creator. Yeah. So it's not atheism.
No.
Deists also differ from agnostics. Agnostics question whether you can know whether there's a God. Deists say that there is a God. There is a creator anyway, right? And that you can use reason to determine that there must be a creator. But agnostics say that it's unknown or unknowable whether there's God. So they differ from atheists and they differ from agnostics. But they also differ from what you would call theists, traditional religion.
Right.
In that theists think that there's a God who actively intervenes in the world and in their lives, who actually hears prayers, who actually acts in human history to make certain outcomes happen in human history. Deists reject all of that.
And I'm going to just interject a little bit of sort of like where they're drawing on some of this. Lucretius, On the Nature of Things, was a book that Jefferson consulted, and it makes many of these same points, although they're making them in first century Rome. So this is not Jefferson's primary classical influence, but it's one of them, and it kind of influences his way of looking at religion and deities and things like that. Lucretius goes a lot further with the lampooning the superstitions of the Romans at times in the work. But this is a very influential text for people who are more secular and looking at a sort of secular approach to the world that came about from the ancient world.
And deism was popular during the 17th and 18th century portion of the Enlightenment, so in the 16 and 1700s. And so the U.S. founding fathers either were deists or were aware of deism and its principles.
Jefferson was not the only one.
No, but this book, there is a very good book called The Swerve that talks about how this book was discovered by chance during the Renaissance, and how it later became a text that many drew upon to define their religious belief in the 18th century. And the author of The Swerve is Stephen Greenblatt, and this book did win the National Book Award, I believe, in 2012?
National Book Award in 2011.
2011, yes.
And then it won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2012.
Well worth checking out, even if you're not interested necessarily in classical works, from ancient Greece and Rome. Good book to kind of see how some of that influenced the thinking of the Enlightenment and also America's founders.
Another thing to note, too, is when I was doing some research for this series, talking about people like George Washington and George Mason, who are both founding fathers from Virginia, I get the impression, I'm in over my head to some extent here, but I get the impression from reading through their views that Christians and deists of the time did not necessarily see a need to make a big distinction between those two sets of beliefs. And that, in fact, in some cases, they merged them. Some of them did. Some of the founding fathers merged them into what's been called a Christian rationalism or Christian deism, which kind of was something along the lines of you did believe in Christian doctrine to some extent. You believed in the divinity of Christ. You believed that the Creator was the Christian God, but you nonetheless viewed it all through the prism of deism, through rationalism. It wasn't about miracles. It wasn't about anything superstitious. It was all about reasoning. So there was actually a kludge of the ideas of deism and Christianity into something that I've seen some authors call Christian rationalism or Christian deism. And I think some of the founding fathers actually had that sort of orientation because they were men of the Enlightenment, but they also came from a culturally Christian background. And that was a merger of the two in their mind.
And they're trying to resist having the sort of problems that plagued Europe in the 1600s, where you have religion being like this huge source for conflict, a huge source for civil war, a huge source for persecution of people, sometimes irrationally for their beliefs, or due to circumstances. I mean, Voltaire has in Candide, there's the famous Lisbon earthquake, and as a result, there is an auto de fe, in which an act of faith is what it's called, in which people are rounding up the usual suspects, Jews, people that appear to read the wrong books and things. They're basically burned at the stake, and this is something the founding fathers do not want to see happen here. They do not want to see people persecuted for their beliefs, or treated wrong because they may eschew pork, for example, thereby indicating that they're Jews who haven't really converted.
Yeah, and you also see, and again we'll get into this later, but you see a focus for at least some of the founding fathers on civic tranquility and the role of religion in that, and they saw that it could play a positive role, but also could play a negative role. We'll get into that later. We won't get into it now, but both of those things were in play there too.
Well, and you have, I would say, Thomas Jefferson did own a copy of the Quran, so he was aware of other religions, and he called them Mohammedans.
Well, that was a common term.
That was a common term.
I know.
Common term back then.
I'm laughing at it now because it's funny now, but
that was the term of art. That was what they referred to them as.
Right. And then you have Ben Franklin, who I would consider largely an atheist. Maybe not purely by definition, but darn close to it.
He didn't totally eschew Christian morality. He did think of Jesus as being a great moral teacher, like Confucius, like Buddha, or like anyone else for that matter, who might have appealed to a higher nature, but certainly not divine. He made a joke. He said that he thought that Jesus was probably the product of some woman who got impregnated by a Roman soldier, and there was the virgin birth.
That's a good one.
Yes.
That's a good one. Well, and then you also had founding fathers like Patrick Henry, who was a much more fervent Christian.
And Episcopalian.
And wanted, at least, he was in favor of having the citizens pay into the church.
And this is about morality, though. I mean, I would say that his appeal is, this is a way of keeping people moral by keeping them connected to the Episcopalian Church, which is his church.
The founders rejected the idea of setting up a Christian state or a religious state of any kind, and specifically forbade the idea in the First Amendment. The Founding Fathers did not create a secular government because they disliked religion. Many of them were believers themselves. Yet they were well aware of the dangers of a powerful state backing or requiring an official religion. They had studied and even seen firsthand religious wars and persecutions in Europe. And during the American colonial period, alliances between religion and government produced oppression and tyranny on our own shores. Avoiding that at all costs was a goal in our nation's birth. And I would argue that by avoiding any established religion in America, the founders actually fostered a much more diverse marketplace of religious ideas, practice, and belief, including the lack thereof. As we go further into the series, we're going to cover the Age of Enlightenment and its influence on our founding fathers, and also we'll cover the founding fathers themselves and their individual religious beliefs and attitudes. And we cannot overlook the First Great Awakening, which burst onto the colonial American scene in the 1730s.
In our next episode, we're going to get into the religious founding of each of the 13 colonies, I believe.
In great detail.
Excellent.
That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, Blake Henke. Till next time.